Hey guys, how's it going? KRIPP'S here. It's time for another Diablo IV build guide. This build is the Ice Shard Sorcerer, and I believe it is the strongest overall Sorc build. Now, just because it's the strongest doesn't mean you should play it. The different Sorc builds are quite different, and they're fairly competitive amongst each other. I would say that even though I think this build will edge out others, it won't be by a lot, and I think you should consider builds largely on their playstyle as long as they're fairly competitive, which fortunately several are. Now, Ice Shards is a pretty powerful skill on its own, but it starts to really take off once you get your mana in check. And that might take a while. So while it doesn't seem like a great starter, the thing is, there's a lot of builds that aren't great starters. It's actually still a pretty good build to start on. It's also extremely high single target. I think, except for perhaps some lucky hit chaining combo builds, it might come out as the top single target Sorc build in the game. It has very good area of effect as well. Not the best for Sorc, but very good. And it's quite tanky, thanks to the fact that we are going to be burning our targets as well as freezing them. With the main issue just being mana management that I think should alleviate after some time. So, as always, KRIPP builds. You want one? Well, you're going to have to find it on Mobalytics. I will have a link below to this specific build, but all of my builds are hosted on Mobalytics, so if you're ever curious what I am playing, or what I considered playing, or maybe what Rania is playing in this season of Diablo IV, that is where you should be heading. The Ice Shard build. So, enchantments make a pretty big impact. Ice Shards is a skill that does ridiculous damage. Launch 5 Ice Shards that deal 35% damage each. Okay, so that is 175, and then you deal 25%. That's X. So that's always multiplying. 25% more. So it does almost like 220% damage to frozen enemies. You might be thinking, well, it might be hard to hit targets that are frozen all the time. Well, that's why we have, while you have a barrier, casts of Ice Shards treat enemies as if they were frozen. So we're always getting that bonus, making Ice Shards one of the highest damage skills in the game. And we get Ricochet, which gives us partial of our AoE. A big part of the AoE for this build is that Ice Shards, the enchantment automatically fires to nearby frozen enemies. And it's difficult to say exactly how it works, but it seems to fire twice a second. We're not sure if it works off of your attack speed. It might, but possibly not. And each of those shards goes to each nearby frozen enemy. So if you Frost Nova with 10 mobs, each of those 10 mobs gets an Ice Shard. Now, Ice Shard also has Ricochet, which is pretty interesting, and the Ice Shard specific skill enchantment lets Ice Shard pierce. Now, we did have a day 1 patch that has been data mined, but there are some skill interactions that we don't know. If it has survived, and I do imagine it has survived because it's pretty specific, what happens when a piercing Ice Shard also ricochets is you get another Ice Shard. So it doubles the amount of Ice Shard when that triggers, making it, well, pretty ridiculous area of effect as well. And that is largely where the clear comes from. So we pick up Ice Shards, max it. Your core skills deal 9% more damage when cast above 50 mana. This is where some of the tricks come into play. We are using all of the defensive skills once again, and very much like the Firewall build, we are going to want defensive skills on our Amulet, which will give us +1 to all defensive skills, including enabling Ice Armor, which we wouldn't otherwise have to spec. So you get Ice Armor for free if you have defensive skills or all skills. Flame Shield with the heal, I very much like the heal. Teleport with the damage reduction, that's almost mandatory. And because most of our damage comes when we are freezing the targets around us, it is an absolute mandatory case for this build to max out your Frost Nova. I would say that you're going to look for boots with plus skills to Frost Nova and movement speed, and the other stats are not going to matter. You're going to want Amulet with defensive skills right after CDR, which effectively is skills in Frost Nova. Frost Nova is the bread and butter of the Ice Shards build. We're getting those auto Ice Shards, and we're getting them to burn with Firebolt. And that's why, after, of course, we get the mandatory barrier-related things, we get Devouring Blaze. You deal 30% increased critical strike damage against burning enemies. If they're also immobilized, this bonus is increased to 75%. We're going to have tons of hits. We're going to be scaling Lucky Hit. I think there's actually perhaps a case for Meteor instead of Firebolt, because Meteor we can make immobilize. But, you know, that we'll have to test when the game comes out. The reason this is so strong is because the Devouring Blaze critical strike damage against burning enemies is a critical strike damage multiplier. It's x30. So if you crit, it's going to do your critical damage, and then if it's burning, it's going to add 30 multiplier on all of that damage. So it is completely insane. And because some skills, usually you have to hit something for them to then be burning. You have to hit them again to get the bonus. Ice Shards hits multiple times in chains like crazy. The burning application of Ice Shards is actually very potent, unlike some other burning enabled skills. The reason we really want burning on all our skills is the crit multiplier, but also because almost all the damage reduction available on gear and paragons has to do with targets that are burning. So it's also acting significantly as our defensive layer. Deep Freeze might seem a little bit slow, but Deep Freeze gives you a long immunity, lowers your other cooldowns, including Frost Nova, of course. And in my pretty lengthy experience using Deep Freeze does a really good job in just freezing the screen constantly. And that is really powerful. You are going to want any form of freezing available to you. Cold builds have actually very strong passives in the ultimate area. Permafrost, frost skills deal increased damage to elites, damage to chill, damage to frozen, and again, Ice Shards is treating the target as if it's frozen, and Blizzard devs have confirmed that if something is frozen, it is also chilled. So in the case just specifically Ice Shards, we are getting 9% more and 18% more. Icy Touch, 12% increased cold damage to vulnerable enemies, and Lucky Hit to give us mana back. I'll go over this in a second. Lucky Hit makes your next Frost skills 10% chance on a Lucky Hit to cost no mana and deal 40 more damage, and the chance is doubled against vulnerable. Frost Nova also gives vulnerable instead of freeze, which is really important. Those things that automatically spawn can trigger avalanche, so it starts to get really out of control. I quite like this mana one, but the main crutch of Sorc is you can't get a lot of crit chance on your gear. In fact, you can get very little. You have to use Elementalist Aspect, which core mastery skills cast at or above 100 mana. Again, a lot of crit chance. I would put this in the Amulet if it means getting you to close to 100, but if you're overcapped on crit chance, you can switch this with another aspect of your choosing. Aspect of Control or whatever else you want. Aspect of Control is pretty good because, again, the target is always frozen when you have a barrier, and you're always going to have a barrier. Just to quickly go over a few things, because we really want to always be casting over 100 mana, this build is not going to be like silky smooth until you can actually get your mana pool over 100. I would say that you want to do a full cast and then begin the second cast. And when you begin the second cast, you still want to be over 100 mana with nothing but your regeneration. So you're going to want like 128 total mana, or you can get mana cost reduction on boots and I believe amulet to kind of go the other way on that one. That's when the build is going to start to feel pretty smooth, because that's when every single cast of Ice Shards will crit, and crit damage has been buffed on the Paragon tree, ladies and gentlemen. A quick review of the other aspects. Lucky Hit, well, you have a barrier. armor, of course. Damage based on available primary resource. This build, even though it constantly uses spenders and doesn't have a basic skill, the idea is that we sustain near perfect mana. Less damage from crowd control or vulnerable. This gives you crowd control duration, which is also very nice. Damage while you have a barrier. Avalanche, instead of giving you one cast, now gives you 2 casts. I don't know if there is a point where on average you wouldn't need to use this anymore. I feel like you might always need to use this one, but I'm not sure. Another option is Frostburn. I think the Frostburn unique is kind of interesting for this build. You might be able to chain freezes because your lucky hit is so high. But again, that remains to be seen. And using a cooldown restores 15 to 25 mana. Again, it might be a little bit annoying with mana management, but you have to keep in mind that Frost Nova has a very fast cast time, Teleport is instant, Flame Shield is instant, and Ice Barrier is instant. And it's kind of hard to tell because you have to be really fast. You can actually cancel Deep Freeze. And I believe if you cast and cancel Deep Freeze, it is instant. You kind of have to wait out the period of pressing the button twice. Now, for Paragons, there are quite a lengthy one. I think that's actually the Firewall build, so we'll go there. So this is the Ice Shard build, but I want to go over another thing here. A lot of people, they talked about playing Chain Lightning or playing Charge Bolts. There has been a fairly recent discovery in skills by very dedicated Diablo IV researchers. They counted every frame of every skill they found in various VODs from like the Server Slam and the first playthrough, and it turns out some skills have a hidden attack speed multiplier. So while you might be thinking that Chain Lightning is one of the best skills, it doesn't actually have any bonus attack speed, while Ice Shards has 25% bonus attack speed multiplier. It just doesn't take as long to cast it. It has bonus cast time for free. So you get 25 more multi on a 220 damage skill that enables your freeze effects to automatically trigger. This is what makes Ice Shard the strongest single target skill that Sorc has at a baseline. Again, there might be some crazy builds where you're lucky hit proccing a bunch of different skills, and I think you can surpass Ice Shards potentially. But as a baseline, casting a skill towards the boss, Ice Shards is the #1 skill on Sorcerer. As far as Paragon goes, I have a fairly unique build. Because we're actually burning all the time, we can use Flame Feeder. Flame Feeder gives you extra damage to burning targets, but also the additional bonus is 10% more direct damage to burning enemies. Again, very, very good. We also really want to get critical strike chance, so we have a higher incentive to use glyphs that have a dexterity requirement rather than a willpower or int requirement, even though those are pretty good as well. I always like to go into the board that I have the most action in, but in this case it's not exactly needed, but it is a good choice. I think you have some flexibility with the order here, especially based on maybe if you find a specific glyph over another one. So we're using Exploit in Burning Instinct. Burning Instinct has 49 dexterity, which is the highest, tied with another for maximum dexterity. Vulnerable damage is going to be very good for this build. It's going to act as a multiplier. I also like to get chance to execute non-elites because our lucky hit is so high, and we get a little bit of extra attack speed in the mix as well. Damage to burning, damage reduction from enemies that are burning, let's go, and armor, of course. Now there's a lot of really good options. This build has 6 glyphs and 5 Paragon boards with a legendary node. The efficiency has actually surprised me on this build. And again, I will link this for Paragons as well, because Mobalytics in its initial rollout doesn't have quite the details for Paragons yet, but they will eventually. So you can, if you want, move in with a Tactician slotted into Frigid Fate. I would consider Frigid Fate to go pretty early because Frigid Fate has the weakness, which is the vulnerable damage. You can scale up that way. It also gives you Frigid Fate, the skill node, which is dealing cold damage to vulnerable enemies, increases your lucky hit chance by 1% for 5 seconds up to 15%. Well, we do this a lot. And that means avalanche procs, and that means mana procs, and if you're using Frostburn, that means freeze procs. And it's pretty nice to get, well, a little bit of extra lucky hit in there. Why not? You can head over to Conjure Imbiber. It's the elemental summoner one. I don't actually get a lot of willpower. This is kind of, it's still worth it because this is not a burning build. It's not a firewall build. We don't have that much additive damage. So being able to use willpower in a fairly efficient board is pretty valuable. And this is when I was talking about mana. So you're probably not going to see this in a lot of Ice Shard builds. But if we really look at these, this is 16 mana with percent life. 4 mana, 4 mana, 4 mana. Wow, right? That is almost an entire cast of Ice Shards, right? This might be what makes your character cast every time with 100 crit chance rather than like 60% of the time. I think these nodes are deceptively not just good. I think these nodes are deceptively ridiculous. Okay. The other Paragon boards, I have Enchantment Master. I don't believe it's worth getting the Enchantment Master node. I don't think it really does anything other than give you like 1% more burning damage. But I like Elementalist in it because if we scale the nodes, more damage, more resists, not bad. But more importantly, the 40 int requirement is very easy to complete. We don't have to waste a lot of points. And again, it's very tight to actually complete this full board this way. There's a lot of power for this build on Paragon. But the additional bonus, and we do meet the requirement, dealing fire, cold, or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage you deal to them by 5% more for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. So we actually do fire and cold with our ice shards. So like everything does fire and cold effectively, and teleport does lightning and fire. And we do want to be using our cooldowns nonstop for the mana recovery aspect of them. So this is just really good, and it fits very nicely for a very short board into Ceaseless Conduit, which is a horrible board for this build, actually for all builds I would say, except for the fact that it also is the highest dexterity location. Now, they buffed this glyph. 30 critical strike damage with core skills for every 5 dexterity purchased in range. I think this is what really makes Ice Shard stronger than other skills. I think you might see like the Ball Lightning build, it might look like it does more damage, but this is giving you almost 300% critical strike multiplier that we then multiply against burning enemies because of Devouring Flames. So that is so much damage, and this is only for core skills. This is one of the craziest glyphs in the game, and it has been buffed in the launch day patch. It used to give like 19 per 5. Now it's 30 per 5. But this node is obviously garbage, so that's why you kind of want this to be your last board. But you know what? Maybe you can put that glyph there instead and try to finish off on Vulnerable. This is certainly a high-level build to achieve this level of power, but I actually think it's good enough to play as a starter, and I think once you play it, you'll probably agree. Thank you for watching another build guide, and we'll see you guys pretty soon for the next.